Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Jeff Lichtman. Dr. Jeff Lichtman is a psychologist with many years of experience in education and special education. He has a master's degree in school psychology and education from St. John's University and NYU. Dr. Lichtman received his undergraduate and rabbinical training from Yeshiva University, where he completed his doctorate as well. His areas of expertise include individual and group counseling, social skills training, and teacher training. In addition, he is Director Emeritus of the National Jewish Council for Disabilities and Dean of the IVDU schools and a consultant to schools and agencies around mental health, leadership, and promoting the inclusion of all children and adults with disabilities. Welcome, and thank you for presenting today, Dr. Lichtman. We are so happy to have you here with us today. And I am now going to turn the session over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Alina. It's my pleasure to be here. I presented many times at NJCTS, and especially when the organization was beginning, and so I'm really happy to be here. Besides being a psychologist with experience working with children, I'm also the father and grandfather of children, and I'm the father of Jeremy Lichtman. Some of you may know he runs a parent support group on a monthly basis. He's also a psychologist. He has Tourette syndrome, and so I not only, it's not just my professional experience, but my experience as a father, as a parent. So let's get right to it. Let's go to the next slide. This is just what we're going to be doing tonight, but just to give you a sense, and let's go right to the next slide. Okay, let's get right into it. So Cain and Abel. Why do I mention Cain and Abel? Well, Cain and Abel were the first siblings, right? Right in the Bible, in the Torah, Cain and Abel are mentioned almost, shortly after the creation of the world and the creation of Adam and Eve. And if you remember your Bible stories, didn't end so well with Cain and Abel, right? One brother killed the other brother. I'm not gonna get sermonic, and we're not gonna get into it. But I do think it's fair to say, and not that I want to end on a negative note, but siblings from the very dawn of our history have had difficulties getting together sometimes. Okay, and it is in the nature almost of siblings to not get along sometimes. It's certainly true that siblings can get along and often do get along well. But I just, I don't want you, very often we think that our children are a certain way or present with certain challenges, and it's only them, it's nobody else. And that's just generally not true. And it's certainly not true here. Siblings fight. Even when they ultimately have good relationships as adults, and even if they have generally good relationships as children, as siblings, they still fight sometimes. It's just the nature of children who are siblings to fight sometimes. So with that as a backdrop, and before we get into speaking about the siblings and how to make sure that we are taking care of all of our children and meeting the needs of the siblings as well. Here are a couple of things that I think you need to always remember. All right. As Alina said, I'm speaking in generalities. Every individual is unique and every family's circumstance is unique. So here are some of the 4 things that I think you must consider. And certainly that I would be considering if somebody came to me and said my siblings, are having difficulty getting along with their brother or sister with Tourette syndrome. The first is, what's the nature and degree of the special need of the child with special needs, right? Of the child in this case with Tourette syndrome. They're not all the same, right? And let me just point out to you that this applies to Tourette syndrome, but it applies really to all disabilities. We call, some of you I'm sure are familiar with autism, and it's technically called autism spectrum disorder. Actually, all areas of disability are spectrum disorders. All challenges are spectrum. It can be presenting mildly, presenting severely, moderately, varying degrees. And that really, is one of the variables that plays a role in what's going on and how, and potentially affecting the interaction. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Comorbidity, right? We all like, in the profession, we like jargon. Comorbidity, simply saying that a child has something with something else. So if your son or daughter has Tourette syndrome, it's not unusual for them to sometimes have something else. That something else could be a learning disability. That something else could be ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Could be something else. The point here to remember is, what's the Tourette versus what's the ADHD, just to use that as an example. They're not necessarily, sometimes we impose, oh, that's because he or she has Tourette's. It may have nothing to do with their Tourette's. It might have something to do with their ADHD. Or, to bring us to the third point, all of our children have personality. Before they have Tourette syndrome, they're children with unique personalities. Where do those personalities begin? Where do they end? Where does the Tourette syndrome begin and end? So, you might think it's Tourette's, but it might simply be their personality. Some of our children are more outgoing. Some of them are more introverted. Some of them are more energetic. Some of them are quieter. Everybody's got personality. And finally, as we move into the siblings, you have to consider, if you have concerns about the siblings, what is the age of the sibling and the gender of the sibling or siblings? Boys and girls interact in different ways. Brothers and sisters interact in different ways. And certainly, if you're talking about a 5-year-old sibling, that's very different than an 8-year-old sibling. That's very different than an 11-year-old sibling. That's very different than a 15-year-old sibling. So, and which is also a way of saying that these things change over time. They evolve. Hopefully they evolve for the better, right? But they do change. Your children don't stay the same. Thank God they don't stay the same. They grow, they develop, they evolve. So let's go to the next slide. And here, this is just a quote from a sibling. I have a little brother with Down syndrome. Happens to be she has a brother with Down syndrome. One day I went to school and a boy in my class was making fun of my brother. I said, "Hey, that's my brother." He said, "Sorry." I share this with you, and I'm going to have a couple of other slides as we go throughout the presentation with quotes from siblings, because I think it's important to hear from the siblings. I'm going to tell you over and over again, I'm going to share with you, talk to your other children, ask them, don't make assumptions. And isn't it beautiful? Sometimes the same sibling who might be fighting with your child who has Tourette syndrome, you might think might not be getting along with your child who has Tourette syndrome, that same sibling in school or in the playground or outside might be saying, "Hey, that's my brother. Don't make fun of my brother." Let's go to the next slide. Right? Life is filled with many stages, with many different places, and we only see one, typically what goes on at home. Okay. So parents set the stage. You're the movie director. And I want to be very clear. Too often, we kind of blame parents for everything. That's not my intention here whatsoever. I'm a parent. I can tell you as a parent who's now the parent of adult children and a grandparent and having worked with many, many families over the years, that you do the best that you can, and almost no matter what in my experience, when children become adults, at some point they'll come to you and tell you how you did it wrong or why you should have done it differently. So, it's just the nature of the beast, shall I say. We're going to make mistakes. Okay. We're human. How could we not make mistakes? And by the way, the fact that an adult child thinks did it wrong doesn't mean that they're right. It just means that that's their feeling. Okay. And they're entitled to their feelings. But so, schools too often blame parents for things, and the children blame us and we blame ourselves. Let's stop with the blame. Parents, do an amazing job typically, right? Some of us are better. Some of us are a little bit more challenged in this area, but we all work hard to be the best parents that we can be, hopefully. And the key takeaway here, I think, is to remember that what we do, what we say, models for our children, particularly now we're talking about the siblings, models for them how to think about their brother or sister with Tourette's, how to interact with their brother or sister with Tourette's. So let's go to the next slide, please. So parents setting the stage, the first thing to my mind is about how the parent accepts the disability. Not every parent does. I think every parent needs to. And it's really hard to do that. It is really, really hard to do that. But in my experience, those parents who come to terms, and I want to be very clear here. Let's stop for a second. I believe that when you get a diagnosis that your child has Tourette syndrome or any area of disability, we're grief-stricken. I'll certainly speak for myself. When my wife, who happens also to be a psychologist, said to me, I think that Jeremy has Tourette syndrome. We need to explore it. First of all, at first, I went through all the typical stages. I poo-pooed it. I didn't want to hear about it. No, you're not right. What do you mean? What are you saying? No, et cetera, et cetera. And it really took me a while, to come to grips with it and to accept the fact that he had Tourette syndrome. So, and I want to explain to you why I think that is. Nobody expects to have a child with any kind of special needs. Nobody teaches us about that in school. If you go for Lamaze training or whatever, or parenting or anything in preparation for giving birth to a child, as best as I know, certainly when I did it, nobody said, oh, you can have a miscarriage, you can have a child, with special needs. Those things weren't talked about. And I dare say, I don't believe they're talked about now. And so when you get some kind of diagnosis, when it appears to you that something like this is happening, it is, dare I say, the death of a dream. We all have a dream. We may not say it, we may not even be conscious of it, but at least unconsciously, we have a dream of what this child is going to be. I mentioned Jeremy. Jeremy, just yesterday, he and his wife gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. Last night, I had the privilege to hold that infant, and all sorts of things went through my mind. And as part of that, I'm sure part of that was, what's he going to grow up to be? Who's he going to be? What's he going to be? That's normal. We all do that. We say, oh, they should just be healthy, et cetera. But we have dreams for our children, whether we realize it or not. And when they have a disability, that potentially, undermines that dream. That potentially undermines our expectations. So it starts with accepting the disability. If you accept the disability, then the siblings, your other children, are much more likely, much more easily able to come to terms with it. I didn't say easily, I said more easily. So we need to accept the disability. For me personally, I can tell you that again, once I got the diagnosis, it was challenging for me, and it took me some time until I got to the point where I was okay. This is the way that it is, and I think you all know by now that these disabilities, they don't go away. The good news is, if you take Jeremy just as an example, they grow up and they can go to school and have professions and lives, and they can get married, and in this case, they can have children. A diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome does not in any way, shape, or form have to drastically, change or undermine, the life of the child. It will change it in some ways, just as it changes your family's life. So we need to accept the disability and model that for our other children. And let's go to the next slide. So valuing each child individually. Again, every sibling, every child in the family is going to be different. They just are. They have different personalities. It doesn't matter that the same children come from the same mother and father, assuming that's the case. They have different personalities. Even birth order affects their personalities, right? The oldest child versus the youngest child versus the middle child. All these things are variables that affect who they are and how they grow and develop. And it's important for us to remember that we have to value and appreciate who each of them were, who each of them are. They're not going to be the same, and that's okay. We love them for who they are. And the next slide. So, setting the stage, here's I think one of the best ways to set the stage. One of the potential challenges around Tourette's, because of the tics and because, they can stand out. Socialization for the child with Tourette's sometimes can be a particular area of challenge. I think one of the ways to mitigate that, one of the ways to address that early on is by you can't control what goes on in school, but you can control what goes on in your home. And if your home is a welcoming place, if you invite children over for play dates, if this is the place where the kids hang out, then that potentially would be wonderful for the child with Tourette syndrome. And think about the messages that sends to the other siblings as they see, let's call him Timmy or Jeremy or Sarah, who has Tourette syndrome, right? Jeremy who has Tourette syndrome, when he has lots of friends over playing with them, that sends so many vital messages to the siblings about the normalcy of everything. And then let's go to the next slide. Being fair. Okay. You have to be very clear. You want to be fair to all of your children. But let's go to the next slide. Children think that being fair is giving them all the same thing. If you ask, I don't know how old, those of you who are with us tonight, you might have a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. If you ask them, is it fair that they go to sleep at different times? They probably would say no, assuming they go to sleep at different times. They all want to go to sleep at the same time, or certainly the younger children want to go to sleep at the same time as the older child. But that's not about fair. Fair is giving each child what they need, right? So the younger 5-year-old needs to go to sleep earlier because, frankly, they need more sleep. You also need more time with the other children, But fair is giving every child what they need. All right. And we're going to talk more about this later, but it's important to remember you're the parent. You set the stage. All right. They don't have to like everything. They could think it's unfair. It is perfectly fair for you to do different things for and with your different individual children. Not only is it fair, it's necessary sometimes, right? You may be taking your child with Tourette syndrome, to certain therapy appointments or other kinds of things that are needed by that child as you understand it. Okay. So fair is giving every child what they need, which brings us to the next slide. And here again is another quote from same sibling. Please don't be embarrassed. If you think for a while, it's a miracle that God created a new life. God puts disabled children with people who he feels can love and take care of them best. I love my brother. I wouldn't give him up for the world. He is so cute. Now, again, trust me, there are siblings who, certainly will verbalize that they don't like their siblings. You have to take it with a grain of salt. I have 6 grandchildren. 5 of my grandchildren from another child range in age from 11 to 7. 5 children living in the same house, 11 to 7. I want to say I'm embarrassed to say, how often I see some of them fighting with each other. They just do. 1 or 2 of the brothers in particular fight with one of the sisters, but it doesn't mean that they don't love them. And those same siblings I've seen, the same siblings who sometimes fight, almost ferociously with their siblings, can be the same sibling who's defending that same sibling that they fought with just 30 minutes ago from some consequence or some other, thing that seems to be bad. So you have to take everything that they say and do with a little bit of a grain of salt. So let's bring us to the next slide. I believe the parenting is the most difficult task we have. I kind of alluded to that at the beginning. Much easier, I believe, in most cases, to go to work than it is to stay home and parent. Now, I think parenting is also the most enriching task that we have. It's the most wonderful task that we have. But, the opposites can live together. And we can love our children and they can make us crazy sometimes. And don't let anybody suggest to you otherwise. And somebody who tells you the parenting is amazing all of the time is either delusional or lying. It's not. I love my children. I love my grandchildren. Wow, being a grandparent is the best thing in the world. I love being with them. But there are times, there are moments where, I think it's fair to say you're happy that either they go home to their house or you're able to go back to your house. So let's go to the next slide. And here are some things that I want to suggest to you to keep in mind, specifically around the siblings, right? And what you can do. And the first one is to limit caretaking responsibility. And I chose my words here very carefully. Limit caretaking responsibility. That doesn't mean that an older sibling or another sibling, can't have responsibility and even caretaking responsibility. You just want to manage it. You want to limit it. You don't want the sibling to feel that they're a third parent, right? That's what you don't want to do. What you do want to do, however, is manage and reasonably give them responsibility. That is perfectly fine. And that's, again, subject, and I keep saying this over and over again, subject to the age of the different siblings, the nature of the different siblings. And so let's go to the next slide. Let siblings settle their own differences. Right? Siblings fight sometimes. It's not your job, I believe, to always get in the middle of it. It's not your job to settle their differences. In fact, it's healthy for them to learn how to settle their differences together. Not only does it positively, help them to develop skills for their interactions, it actually helps them develop life skills for interacting with others, right? If they can settle their differences between their siblings, they're more likely to have the skills to settle differences that they have with peers and friends and others, because they will have differences, right? It's the nature of life. Do you agree with everybody all the time? Right? Parents, right? Couples fight. There is no couple on this planet that never fight. You know what the difference is between successful, couples and those that are more challenged? How they fight. How they fight. Couples who fight and call each other names, that's not a healthy relationship. But every couple fights, and all the time, siblings will fight. And sometimes you need to step in, but be judicious. You don't have to run and settle everything for them. Which brings us to the next slide. Let's praise siblings. Anything that they're doing that's good, and particularly in relation to their other siblings, and particularly to a sibling, to a child who has Tourette syndrome, should be praised. It is praiseworthy. You want to reinforce it. Why wouldn't you praise it? Why not? In fact, as a quick aside, I'll tell you that we tend to praise children for achievement, right? What'd you get on the test when they come home? And if they got a good grade, oh, that's great. I'm not so impressed with that. I don't think we should be praising achievement so much. You know what I think we should praise? Effort. The child who gets a 60 on a test and then works harder and the next time gets a 75, I really want to praise that child. You worked harder, you studied harder, you figured out how to study better, and you've improved your skills. Amazing. And now, if you want, I'll work with you. I'm sure you can do even better the next time we'll work together. Effort. And if the siblings are making efforts to help, to interact, to support their other sibling, then that is praiseworthy and should be praised. Next slide, please. Schedule special time with the siblings. Right? So if you have 2 children, one with Tourette syndrome, one without. If you have 5 children, one with Tourette syndrome and 4 with that, doesn't matter. Ideally you want to spend special time with each child. It's pretty typical that most parents, mothers in particular, but not limited to that, tend to spend more time with a child who has special needs because there's just more to do around them typically. And that can, as we said earlier, it might not seem fair to the other children. One of the ways to compensate for that is you don't have to give them the same amount of time, but you need to give them some time. So maybe it's going ice skating on Sunday morning together, and that's your special time once a week. Maybe it's having a cup of hot cocoa on Wednesday nights and reading a book together. Maybe it's building Legos and drinking soda. Doesn't matter what it is, but some special time. We're going shopping together. I told you until yesterday I had 5 grandchildren, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and the older sister for sure feels that I spend more time with her brothers, and it happens to be she's right, and she felt it and she pointed it out to me, and we discussed it. And one of the things I said, but okay, we're going to do something special together. What she was particularly pointing out was every summer I take the 3 boys to the Intrepid Museum, and I just don't think that she would appreciate it in the way that the boys did. But I told her, let's pick out something that you want to do, and we're going to do it together. And just this past Sunday, we were supposed to go to Barnes and Noble, to Trader Joe's, and do a couple of things that she wanted. And as it turned out, she had a play date, so maybe it'll be next time. But you guys seek to spend to figure out with the child what is going to be their special time with you. The next slide, please. Okay, here's where it gets a little bit more challenging, okay, because everything is nuanced. But I told you limit caretaking responsibility. That doesn't mean not to involve the siblings. Actually, I think you need to involve the siblings. I want you to involve the siblings. I want you to know for the past 40 years, I've worked with many, many families who have children with a wide variety of disabilities. And the almost, I won't say it's universal because it's not universal, but it is almost, I'm going to say conservatively 80% of the time, teenage adults teenage siblings and adult siblings have so often said to me, my parents don't tell me. I don't know what it is. I don't know what to do. I don't know what not to do. They don't tell me. I wish they would tell me. They don't talk about it. They don't talk with me about it. I think that's a big mistake. And the proof of that, if you will, is all those siblings sharing that with me. They feel frustrated. And here's a piece of psychology that applies to life in general and certainly applies here. What is most challenging for people more than anything else is the unknown. We are pretty resilient, most of us. And if you tell me, X, Y, Z, this is what you have, and this is what it means, and this is what's involved in it, etc. I may not be happy, but at least I know I have some sense of what to expect, and I can begin to deal with it. But if you don't talk about it, if I don't know, wow, that's really scary. It's the worst thing. And so siblings are living there. They're living with their brothers and sisters, who in this case have Tourette. They're living with you, but you're not talking about it. You have to talk about it. Now, listen, different families have different cultures and styles. Some are more open, some are more closed. But I would encourage you in the strongest terms possible to, either openly together or separately and, speak to the siblings. Ask them, do you have any questions about Johnny or Sarah has Tourette's? What do you want to know? What do you want to know? Do you have any concern? Are you scared about anything? Let me put your fears to rest, or let me at least answer your question. And answering the questions to the best of your ability will help to put their fears to rest. So please involve the sibling. You can involve, it could be together, especially at the beginning, you and the sibling with the child with special needs, play together, talk together, but don't leave them out in the cold. It really, I think we as parents, we do that because we want to protect the sibling. This is my challenge. This is my burden, dare I say. I don't want to involve you. That's a mistake. Yes, limit caretaking responsibility. It is your responsibility as the parent. It's my responsibility as the parent to take care of my child with special needs. But that doesn't include not involving their siblings reasonably, appropriately. Which brings us to the next slide. Listen to the siblings. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that you have to, whatever they tell you to do that you should do. That's not what I mean. What I do mean is listen to their input. They have perspectives that you and I don't have. They see their brother and sister in different places, maybe in school, maybe downstairs in the basement when there's a play date, maybe, in the schoolyard or in the synagogue or church, wherever it might be. They interact and see the sibling in different ways and in different settings. And they have information sometimes that you don't have. It's also easy sometimes for us as parents to get stuck. We think our child is X and we don't see how they've changed. And maybe even they haven't changed with us. And yet maybe they have changed on the school bus or in school or in the schoolyard or in the backyard. And we haven't seen it. And maybe the siblings have seen it. So they can provide you with perspective, other perspective, and real time, real life, perception and reality of their brother or sister who has Tourette syndrome. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's another quote. If you're embarrassed, talk to someone. It'll make you feel much, much better. And now, this is a sibling saying it to other siblings. Disabled people have lots of feelings. If the world didn't have disabled children, where would all the love be? And I think indeed they're right. Okay, so when you having Tourette syndrome, having dyslexia, having intellectual disability, there are no rose gardens. They all present challenges. But the child who has that is still a child and still has what to offer the world and is still beautiful and still has what to contribute. And we need to remember that. And Jennifer here is reminding us. And Jennifer is a sibling. So let's go to the next slide. And this sort of brings us to the third, and last part of my presentation. I've already shared with you certainly a framework of thinking and some strategies like involving and listening to the siblings. But here are some other strategies that I would suggest to you that apply to the siblings. Some don't apply to the siblings, but certainly relate to our providing some good balance, if you will, for all of the children together. So the next slide, please. This is about your child with Tourette's. Require the child with special needs to do as much as possible for him or herself, right? We want to enable children. We want to empower them. They may have some challenge, okay? We don't need to add to that challenge, okay? And they have capacity. And if your other children have responsibilities, then that child with Tourette syndrome should have responsibilities. If every night of the week, a different child feeds the dog, puts food in the dog bowl or takes out the garbage or, lays out their clothes, whatever it is, the child with Tourette syndrome, typically should be capable of doing those kinds of things and should be required to do those things. Having Tourette syndrome is not an excuse for not taking care of oneself and learning the skills to take care of oneself and learning the skills to be part of a family, to be part of a community, and to contribute to that community. So that's the first thing. Okay. Let's not infantilize, let's not disable our children who have much, much potential to actualize. Let's, in fact, just the opposite. Let's give them those opportunities for growth and development. Which brings us to the next slide. To teach the siblings how to interact. Sometimes we as parents expect our children to know certain things, to know how to act. Why should they know? Why should they know how to interact? If they're children, if they're younger children, and if they have a brother or sister with Tourette syndrome, why would they know how to interact with them? Why would they know that they should interact with them the same way that they would interact with any other brother or sister? And if there is any reason to interact differently, then how are they supposed to know that unless you tell them? How should they know what to do when their sibling is ticking, is manifesting with tics? What should they do? What should they do when, they want to watch TV or they're playing a video game and their child and their brother or sister is sitting next to them and is making loud vocal sounds and it's bothering them and disturbing them? What should they do? Should they tell them to stop? Should they not tell them to stop? How should they tell them to stop? The point is that it's not fair to have expectations unless you first check to see what they know and don't know and teach them. That's the role. That's one of our roles as parents, is to teach all of our children. Okay. Again, it starts with modeling, right? The parents who set the stage, as I mentioned to you earlier. So how you interact with your son or daughter with Tourette's is going to model and play a very significant role in how the siblings will think about it and how they will or won't know what to do. But it's not just about modeling. It's also about articulating and verbalizing what you're doing and why you're doing it. They don't know. They're not magicians. They're not mind readers. And if you want them to interact in a certain way or not interact in a certain way, you need to teach them how to do that. And how to and why to. Needs meaning. Why do I want you to do this? Why do I not want you to do this? Why I don't want you to tell your brother to stop making noises. Why? It's a reasonable, potentially a reasonable expectation. I don't want you to tell him to stop. But why? And you have to ask yourself why, and then you need to be able to explain that to your child. The next slide, please. Thank you. So this is about the sibling, but it's really about everybody. You want to try as much as possible to provide opportunities for normal family life and activities. Now, listen, normal is highly overrated. One family's normal is another family's, abnormal. But whatever it is that, what are the opportunities that, that you would normally want to engage in? What are the activities that you normally want to engage in? And try to the best of your ability to provide those, notwithstanding the fact that you have a child with Tourette syndrome. I think it's fair to say, and I'm trying to think in terms of my experience, I think there was very little that we did or didn't do differently because Jeremy had Tourette syndrome. Now, there were times, I will tell you, there was one time in particular that comes to mind. I think it was one of those, really, sometimes we're presented in life with a moment that really challenges us because different values come into conflict. And so I remember when Jeremy must have been about, let's see. Oh, I'll say if she was, Jeremy was about 12 years old. His tics at that point in time, which is pretty typical for pre-adolescents and early adolescents, with when hormones are raging and changing, his tics were really, probably at their worst, or certainly amongst the worst times. And his older sister was graduating from high school. We were at graduation, and Daniela, his sister, together with her class, she was in an all-girls school, and they were putting on a cantata, like a little play presentation at graduation. And we're sitting in the audience, and Jeremy starts to tick and make these loud vocal sounds. And it was very, I mean, it was, the room was quiet except for the cantata, and it was pretty loud, and it was bothersome. And I'm sitting there, and I didn't know what to do. On the one hand, I in my very depths of my bones, and from a professional perspective, I think I've dedicated a fair amount of my life to promoting inclusion for all children and all people, regardless of any kind of disability. So here's my Jeremy's got Tourette's. He should be able to be there. He should have the pleasure of watching his sister and their play. On the one hand, on the other hand, he was disturbing. He wasn't intentionally disturbing, but he was disturbing. And these 25 girls or whatever it was worked very hard to put this on. Their families, hundreds of people are sitting in the audience, this special moment celebrating their graduation from high school. Long story short, I took Jeremy out, and we watched a little bit through the window, and then, finally we went back in when, his tick seemed to abate somewhat, and certainly when the cantata was over. So he and I missed a good portion of the cantata. And, that's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, I felt it wasn't fair, talk about fair, that it wasn't fair to, so significantly disrupt this moment for so many other people. It wasn't so simple. But that's, part of the reason why I share that with you is because most of the time it's not like that. Most of the time you can go to the amusement park and you can go to so many different things, and the ticks just become a matter of course if that's the way you perceive them, if that's the way you relate to them, if that's the way you model interacting with them. So for the sake of the siblings and for the sake of everybody in the family, to the degree that you can, provide opportunities and activities that you would, provide, whether or not you had a child with Tourette syndrome. Which brings us to the next slide, and in some ways, what is the most important slide from my perspective. We've talked about challenges, and there can be challenges to the siblings. I won't lie to you. There are times where, I've seen siblings who really resented a brother or sister who had special needs. However, those were far fewer than those where I saw the siblings, relate well, love and care about their child, their brother or sister who had, whether it was Tourette syndrome or anything else. And while there can be negative consequences, positive consequences have been documented. There have been studies around siblings. And some of the things that have come out of those studies is that typically, much more typically, siblings will have increased capacity for empathy, greater tolerance for individual differences, and perhaps most of all, resiliency, because it can present challenges to the sibling. It can. And it's not easy sometimes, as the way that Jennifer did, to stick up for a brother or a sister who's making loud, strange noises or twitching in odd ways. It takes courage. It takes tenacity. It takes resilience. Not easy necessarily, especially for a younger child. And the studies clearly demonstrate that so often what we think is an area of difficulty for the sibling actually in the long run, gives them the opportunity to grow and develop and actually develop greater levels of resilience and empathy. So silver lining, a real silver lining, if you will, for the siblings. But that's only That's not, no, that's a misspeak. Not only, but that's much more likely to happen um, in situations where they see parents modeling acceptance and where they frankly are spoken to and involved. It happens even when they're not involved, but it's so much it's so much easier for them and better for them, for the siblings, when you involve them. And so I'm going to stop here. I've tried to touch on what I think are the important things to consider. Obviously, at the end of the day, every child with special needs is unique, and every sibling is unique, and every family is unique. So these are general guidelines, and then you need to, sort of individualize, shall I say, for who your particular, sibling is, and for your particular situation. And with that, I will stop